In California, the transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. According to the California Air Resources Board, transportation accounts for 37% of total emissions. Within this segment, heavy-duty vehicles alone account for roughly a quarter of these emissions. In a sector that relies heavily on fossil fuels, what can we do to clean up transportation? In my senior research project, I wanted to find the significant sources of greenhouse gases and what could be done to fix them. Specifically, I wanted to examine the use of alternative fuels within the transportation sector. In my studies, I found myself focusing on electric vehicles. This in turn inspired the question of where electrification of vehicles could reduce the greatest amount of greenhouse gas emissions. I decided to focus my project on comparing two major transportation modes, public transit and commercial trucking. To compare the potential emission savings, I used the GREET model. GREET, which stands for Greenhouse Gas Regulated Emissions and Energy Use in Transportation, is a model developed by the U.S. Department of Energy and Argonne National Lab. This model is based on the principles of life cycle analysis, which takes into account the emissions from both the fuel and vehicle production cycles. From initial acquisition to final disposal, this model estimates the total emissions associated with a specified fuel and vehicle. In this case, I will be estimating the emissions from heavy-duty trucks and transit buses. The comparison will include diesel, diesel-electric hybrid, and full electric vehicles. The variables inputted into the GREET emissions calculator included average annual fuel consumption, fuel economy, vehicle miles traveled, and engine type. In a vehicle-to-vehicle comparison, I found that freight trucks consumed more fuel and emitted more short tons of CO2 than their transit bus counterparts. In a fleet-wide comparison, I created model fleets to replicate typical transit and freight operations. The model transit fleet consists of 475 transit buses and 185 shuttle buses. The freight fleet consists of 1,300 heavy-duty combination freight trucks and 1,100 single-unit trucks. These numbers reflect the averages of the top 100 transit and freight fleets. I then altered the distribution of engine types amongst these numbers to reflect the varying degrees of electrification. This includes a baseline fleet of diesel vehicles with 15% diesel-electric vehicles. I then shifted 10, 20, 50, and finally 100% of the vehicles to full electric.